Thank you very much, Roberto. I am immensely grateful to Professor Cittanini and also Roberto Palermo and Luca, as well as the rest of the organizing committee for this wonderful privilege to participate in a very, very special meeting. And of course, I must thank Roberto for inventing this title for me, which he obviously tailor-made specifically. But I would like to start my talk with a few words from someone that I hope we will all recognize.
Oh, goodness.
512.
512, which is 2,600 grams. 5 pounds 12 ounces, which is 2,600 grams.
I am now handing the baby to Dr. Edwards, whose brains, skill, and perseverance has made this birth possible. He started this work some 20 years ago and has concentrated a great deal of time and energy into the project. He's been assisted by Jean Purdy, who is in the group. She has been our main assistant.
Want to hold the baby?
This technique is still in its beginning phases, and there are some problems remaining to be solved. But it is hoped that centers will be set up where people have been properly trained, and this technique will become available to many women all over the world. It is, of course, something which requires to be very carefully controlled and given to people in a very strictly medical, ethical manner.
So, Mr. Steptoe, of course, was absolutely right. And we must look in detail now. He really knew what he was talking about. I mean, Simon has given us a fantastic background, and I will skip through some of my slides because Simon has already told you about it. But let's look a little more detail at what Mr. Steptoe had in mind. As you've already heard, when they started working together in 1968, it took them 10 years of close collaboration and teamwork. During this 10-year period, they never stopped working. There were 70 publications. Simon has already pointed out how incredibly difficult it was, the logistic problems. They had limited theater access, failure, disappointment, no financial support, no real funding. Many, many hurdles in endocrinology and reproductive biology had to be overcome. But they were an immensely experienced and highly ingenious and determined team. And they persevered in the face of opposition and criticism. As Simon has already told you, biology threatens man's sense of dignity. So 10 years of trials and research before the first birth. Why did it take so long? Well, we've already heard some of the details. Technical challenges. I'm not going to read this list. These are all of the things that all of us take so much for granted now. As though it had always been written in stone. We just take it for granted. But they had to approach every single one of these and think about it and try to understand what was the right way to do it and really invent the right way to do each one of these different things. Now remember that they were a supremely experienced team. They had outstanding skills, expertise, and experience. Patrick had started doing laparoscopies in Oldham as early as 1962. He went to France and to Germany to study with the doctors who were pioneering the technique, and he went back to Oldham and he developed his expertise by practicing in the post-mortem room. He had a very, very skilled and dedicated nursing team. So from the clinical side, they had really, it was as good as it could get. Now, as we've already heard, Bob had been studying this problem for nearly 20 years. He had studied reproductive biology, endocrinology, biochemistry, physiology, chemistry, physics, the principles of tissue culture. He spent a year working with the expert in tissue culture at that time, John Paul, in Glasgow. They also had the wonderful help of Jean Purdy, who was a nurse by training. So she could contribute everything that was required in the laboratory in terms of sterile technique, infection control. She followed all the recipes with immense attention to detail, close observation. She kept meticulous records, fortunately. I've spoken to the mother of Alistair, in particular, Grace MacDonald, who has the highest praise for Jean. She had wonderful empathy for patients, and she provided moral support for everyone in the team. But overall, she brought what we now recognize as total quality management to the work that they were trying to do. But ultimately, the challenge of a live birth required 4 different things. They had to be able to make viable, healthy embryos, which involved understanding how to produce healthy, mature eggs, so the endocrinology, the timing, the color system. They had to decide on the best time for putting the embryos back, day 5, 2, 3, 4. The correct embryo transfer technique. They did try surgical transfer a few times. And a major problem, stumbling block, was to make sure that the uterine endometrium was receptive for implantation. They were worried about the adverse effects of stimulation and luteal support. In 2003, after Bob sadly passed away, all of the records that mostly Jean had kept in Oldham were released from the farmhouse where he lived, and they came up to Bourne Hall because they contained a lot of confidential patient data. So I spent a few years going through all of the records and putting everything into Excel spreadsheets. This was, of course, they didn't have computers in those days, so Jean kept all the records by hand, tabulating everything by hand, but I put them all into an Excel spreadsheet, one for each year. And this is just a summary of the data that I found. Martin Johnson and I wrote a compilation of 6 papers describing all of this work. So we identified a total of 520 procedures, of which 495 were for laparoscopy, 457 egg recoveries attempted. Eggs were found in 436. 165 cycles with embryos, and they did 112 embryo transfers, as well as 6 gift procedures. The first embryo transfer was done in December 1971. And then overall, we identified 282 patients who participated in this work, which of course means that some of them had more than 1 cycle. One lady, in fact, the very first lady to achieve a pregnancy, in fact, had 10 attempts. She had 10 laparoscopies. And her pregnancy was the first one, which was June 1985, but sadly, it was a cornual ectopic. The 2 live births, we all know, July 1978 and January 1979. Now, the records that I started looking at began in January 1969, and they were numbered consecutively. The first patient in January 1969 was L169. But we don't have any records before January 1969. We have to imagine that there might have been 169 patients before this group that we identified. They had 2 further pregnancies, one in 1978, which sadly was a triploid. It was L673, and then another very sad neonatal death, where a baby boy was born prematurely. So overall, they had a total of 5 pregnancies and 2 live births. I identified a timescale of events, of things that they were looking at, the problems that they were trying to solve. I'm not going to read them all out, but they had to first of all figure out how to take the eggs out. They invented what they called a new suction gadget, and Simon has already shown you a picture of that. They identified excellent embryos as early as 1970 and blastocysts in August and September 1970, and these papers were published in Nature. So you can imagine they must have been very optimistic by that time, thinking, yes, we've got it, we can make embryos. But it took a very long time and a lot more work. So they actually spent more than 2 years just studying the endocrinology. They did between April 73 and December 1975, they monitored hundreds and hundreds of natural cycles, just trying to work out the endocrinology with and without stimulation. They eventually started monitoring serum. Now, the other thing you have to remember is that we take monitoring urine or serum very much for granted. You just send it to the lab and the machine does it. They didn't have this advantage. The women had to take 24-hour urine collections that were sent away to some external lab. It cost money to do it. The results came back later on. They didn't know when they should be monitoring, how many times they should be monitoring. But as Simon has said, by November 1977, when the high gonavis kit became available, they decided to go back to nature and do only natural cycles. And that's what they did from November 1977 until they stopped working in Oldham in July 1978. So Simon has already shown you these. Midnight Drama, it's a girl. The theme of drama and intrigue. After all the stress and strain. But of course, as we've already heard, it didn't last very long. When Bob was presented with the Lasker Award in September 2001, it was said, most advances in medicine proceed in small steps. A precious few are great leaps. We know that IVF was a great leap because Edwards and Steptoe were immediately attacked by an unlikely trinity, the press, the Pope, and prominent Nobel laureates. So, pause for 2 years, and Bourne Hall Clinic was opened. Pioneers planned the clinic to spread work. Now, having done nothing for 2 years, they admitted their first cohort of patients in October 1980, 23 patients, and this is what is written in the records. The timing of the operation is entirely dependent on the patient's menstrual cycle, which governs when ovulation will take place and is unchangeable by the scientific staff. The date of admission to the clinic is determined from information from previous menstrual cycles and from temperature charts. Every patient had to take their basal body temperature every single morning, and they would come to the clinic with piles and piles so that we could identify which date they were likely to ovulate. So of the 23 patients that were admitted, they did 9 single embryo transfers, and fortunately, they did the first 2 embryo transfers on October the 27th, and one of them was successful. She had, the second case they did was a viable pregnancy, and the 23rd case was another viable pregnancy, and they both delivered healthy babies the following summer. So that was immensely encouraging. Can you imagine coming from Oldham, doing absolutely nothing, starting up in porta cabins in the middle of nowhere with all of the world against you, and being able to unbelievably replicate this success? Now let's just look at what was going on in the rest of the world at that time. We have LOUISE and Alistair. And thank you very much, Simon, for telling us all about Durga, born in India, finally recognized in 2006. And they were, as Professor von Sturtevant told us this morning, they were working also in Monash, and he benefited a great deal from their work. Their first baby was born in June 1980, and from the Jones, Howard and Georgiana Jones, their first baby was born in December 1981. And again, I don't need to tell you too much about our meeting because Simon has already told you, but the headline said, baby makers plan teach-in, and again, Patrick says, untrained must not try test tube technique. Success is dependent on the partnership of science and clinical medicine. So in early 1981, Bournehall already had a number of ongoing pregnancies, 103 ongoing pregnancies, and several babies born. And more pictures of that historic meeting with Simon in color this time down at the front. This is a table. The proceedings of that meeting were published in a book. We call it the Pink Book, the Bible, Human Conception in Vitro, where all of the different aspects were discussed. And all of the groups who participated contributed the data that they had until that time. So we can see that apart from Bournehall, Patrick and Bob and the Australian group, there was very little success. But the meeting obviously was a success because very shortly after that, IVF births from the other teams that were present at that meeting began to appear. So France in February and May, Germany in April, Sweden and Austria. A second reunion meeting was also held at Bournehall in September 1984. We had a few more reunion meetings. Some of you in the audience will remember, recognize your photos from these wonderful meetings where the pioneers were able to share their experience and discuss new directions. Very, very important. So spreading the passion. Well, the clinical side, the medical side of IVF, or infertility in fact, was reasonably well organized. I understand that Roberto has told me that you had one of the first fertility societies here in Italy. Professor Cittadini, I'm sure, was instrumental in organizing that. And Patrick Steptoe had started the British Fertility Society in 1974. But Bob recognized very wisely and very clearly that it needed a lot more than that. It needed the collaboration between medicine and science. So Simon Brown has written a book about the history of ESHRE. And there was a meeting in May 1984 where the aspirations presented by Bob Edwards and Jean Cohen that became the seed from which ESHRE grew and flourished. They described their idea of a democratically elected and governed European society with its own journal, annual meeting, training workshops for the exchange of scientific knowledge between clinicians and scientists in Europe. And these dreams, all of you who knew Bob will recognize immediately, so passionately presented by Bob to make them sound as though they were already happening. The practice and progress of reproductive medicine are dependent on both scientific and clinical knowledge, and the mission statement is to promote the study of reproductive science and medicine and the treatment of infertility. And so ESHRE hit the ground running with their first annual meeting, chaired by Professor Diedrich. They had 657 participants, almost 350 members at that time. The second meeting with Professor von Sturtevant and Professor Crosignani organized the first consensus workshop in Capri. So really, they really did hit the ground running. And by 1997, the membership was 3,000. By 2016, almost 7,000. The 34th annual meeting last year had 10,000 participants. So we will come back a little bit more to the importance of ESRE, because it is absolutely underpins the value of education and teaching in IVF. But in the meantime, Bob hadn't stopped. He continued to share his passion. And in September 1989, he decided to inaugurate workshops at Bourne Hall. So this was our very first workshop, September 1989. We had delegates from Belgium, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, Singapore, Sri Lanka, India, Japan. It was very successful, and so we continued to set up workshops and seminars at Bourne Hall. We continued from 1989 until 2005. We had a number of different types of courses, seminars for nurses, for GPs, specialist workshops. We had at least 300 delegates every year. So by 2005, we probably had almost 5,000 visitors to Bourne Hall. More than 40 countries represented. And this, remind you, was an inspiration that was started by Bob with his passion to share the knowledge and make sure that what Patrick said in the beginning, that IVF should only be carried out by people who are properly trained and educated. Now, I was in charge of directing this series of workshops, and it very soon came to my attention that the majority of the people who came to Bourne Hall were gynecologists. And through these workshops and through the meetings, it became also even more clear that there was definitely a need for structured scientific training. So we started in 1994 a dedicated science course, the Biology of Assisted Conception. But again, we had 10 clinicians for biologists, and it was only 1 week, a very minimal overview. So clearly, although the medical side of assisted reproduction, gynecology, the background is covered in the medical curriculum, there was no way for a biologist to learn what they needed to know in order to carry out essential work in the lab. So, a group of scientists who had been involved in the field since the early 1980s, and I think most of them are in the audience here, proposed a different kind of society for scientists in reproductive medicine to bring education, collaboration, and training into the science of reproductive medicine and establish clinical embryology as a professional discipline. Several other countries had already started this initiative with their own societies, and they had started to initiate training schemes. We registered Alpha as a registered charity to advance the art and science of clinical embryology. And this provided a platform and a template for other national societies in other parts of the world. So they were able to use all the paperwork that had been approved by either UK charity and start their own society and begin to build upon sharing the experience. So by 2001, we had members from more than 45 countries, and 15 countries had their own national societies. So we started to think about structured training for clinical embryology. Now, I know that Simon Fischel had started an MSc in Nottingham in early 1990s, 92. But as far as I know, there were not many embryologists who were able to take part. Now, the reasons for this are quite clear. The same thing that happened at Bourne Hall. The medical people were able to get sponsorship from pharmaceutical companies because they have a vested interest. The biologists the sponsors at that time had no vested interest in sponsoring biologists. So we tried to think of a way of bringing the science of IVF into something that was attainable for people who were working in an IVF lab so that they could begin to learn all of the different aspects of the science of IVF that are very important. When I tried Cambridge and Oxford, they were not interested, but in 1997, a small new university in Austria proposed a course for advanced studies in clinical embryology. Syllabus was covered in 10 modules over 2 years, and we had an international faculty of very experienced scientists. We had residential modules in Krems, in Bournehall, and in Naples. So between 1998 and 2001, 27 students took part in this advanced course, postgraduate course for clinical embryology. And we had 2 very successful graduating classes. I hope you will recognize our chairperson here. So this was the first graduating class and the second graduating class. And I am absolutely delighted to confirm that all of the people who participated in this intensive training have continued to be leaders in the field and continued to share their knowledge and their passion and spreading it on to the younger generation who badly need the education. Sadly, that course was not sustainable. I mean, although it was very valuable, it was intensely hard work, and administratively it just wasn't sustainable. But in 2000, with the help of Professor Roger Gosden, we established a distance learning course at the University of Leeds. So for this course, people from all over the world who are working in IVF labs are able to learn the science of IVF by distance learning and come to Leeds only 3 times over 2 years in order to take exams and have some practical sessions. So far, we have had more than 300 students from more than 40 countries. Now, I'm delighted to say that things have really moved on. 18 years later, university MSc courses for clinical embryologists are now available worldwide. There are too many to number, but there are at least 6 now in the UK, including Oxford, who refused to have anything to do with it in 1995. So a career path for clinical embryologists is finally becoming available. And training, accreditation, and certification is now mandatory for clinical embryologists, with structured schemes that are available in many countries. This new generation is, of course, dependent upon the sharing of knowledge and experience. So this brings us to the title of my talk, The Undisputable Value of Teaching. We saw this slides already this morning, projecting into the future. Malcolm Faddy and Roger Gosden are projecting the cumulative numbers of people worldwide to be conceived by ART. So let's look at the past. In the 1980s, it was a 10-day inpatient treatment, daily urine collections every 3 hours, laparoscopic oocyte recovery, general anesthesia, bed rest, intensive and laborious. There was no particular training or education for IVF laboratory procedures. We were dependent upon the people who had worked with Bob and with Jean to share their knowledge, but there was nothing written. And those of you who know Bob will understand the difficulties. But now, it's offered as a simpler, streamlined, and planned outpatient procedure, which has its pros and cons in terms of the patients, because it is perceived to be much easier. Patients think that it's going to be easier and more successful. But in fact, the stress and the trauma has not changed. It has not changed. But we do have IVF labs staffed with highly skilled, trained, and educated personnel. 1 in 6 to 8 couples experience some form of fertility problem. We have a wide range of treatments, an estimated 7 to 8 million IVF babies born worldwide. Assisted reproductive technology, we all know, is now a global, large-scale commercial business. And this commercial business now does include the IVF laboratory. So coming back to ESRE, with the help of ESRE and all of the numerous very important national societies, I think that the visions of the pioneers continued to be fulfilled, thanks to all of the hard work of all of you here and to the organization of meetings such as this. ESRE started an official certification for clinical embryologists in 2008, and by 2016, 1,344 embryologists had obtained earthly certification. You all know all of the different advantages. We heard this morning Professor Gotts about the wonderful training that's available in reproductive endocrinology and laparoscopy. So there are now resources for every single aspect of assisted reproduction technology. The 33rd annual meeting had 10,000 participants, and your current chair tells me that he is expecting 11,000 in Barcelona. And significantly, 1,698 participants were commercial exhibitors. So I'll just conclude by saying, if we have been able to see further, it has certainly been by standing on the shoulders of giants. And we must never, ever forget that the creation of a new life is a long and complex process that can fail at any step. Each step can only succeed if all previous steps have been correctly carried out. Every link in the chain is essential, and without any doubt, we must continue to promote education and collaboration to continue to fulfill the visions of our founding fathers and all of you pioneers who are here. Thank you very much.